Hey everyone, welcome to Reddit Readout. Today we are checking out Entitled Parents. Story 1. I had to deal with an entitled kid and mother for years. Back when I was a young kid in elementary school, my mom had a friend group of other parents, and while some of the kids were good, one was awful. He would bully the other kids, including my brother and I. He would try to steal from whoever's house we were at. Luckily for me, he only come over to my house a few times and I watched him like a hawk. And he would try to start fights with other kids, including my brother and I, and often succeeded. I would refuse to hit him until he hit me, and because I was the second oldest and the strongest in the group, he wasn't a problem. A big problem I had with him was when he tried to start a fight with my brother. While my brother and I don't always get along, if you FCK with him, you FCK with me. Now as time went on, the entitled kid realized my brother had a temper, and if he harassed him enough that my brother would attack him, and so he did that, got my brother to attack him, and when I figured out what he was doing, I beat him. When I was done with that kid, he had a bloody nose and had the wind knocked out of him. Did I go overboard? Yeah. Anyway, this incident caused my mom, my brother, entitled kid, and entitled mom to have a talk. Now you would assume we would have a calm conversation about how her son keeps causing fights and that I did go overboard, right? Wrong. Almost immediately she pins all the blame on my brother and I, because according to her, her son was just stating the truth about my brother and that I shouldn't have gotten involved in the situation. Keep in mind that number 1, he called my brother things like fat, stupid, etc. All things that are not true. Number 2, this kid was slightly older than my brother and bigger than him. If I hadn't gotten involved, my brother could have gotten hurt. I know I overreacted, but when I attacked the kid, all I saw was red. After the meeting, my mom took away my iPad for a few days for going too far when I attacked the kid, but made it very clear it wasn't because I attacked the kid but because I went too far when I attacked him, basically saying thanks for standing up for your brother but not to go that far. As time went on, my mom started going less and less to meet with that group of friends because that kid's mom would never believe he did anything wrong. Even when he tried to steal one of my new Lego sets, it was fairly small and very cool to little kid me, she said that he deserved it and that I should let him have it and that I was being selfish. At the time we didn't have much money and I was too young to make my own money, so I didn't get new toys, especially Lego sets, that often. At one point his mother tried to take the Legos from me herself and my mother told her to go away. Anyway, eventually my mom just stopped going there, so I didn't see him for about a year, but then my brother and I were invited to one of the other kids' birthdays and we went, but so did the entitled kid. When we got there he was there, but we avoided him. From what we saw, he hadn't changed. Anyways, years later I learned that apparently his father had just up and left when he was younger. Probably because of the mom. If that's why the kid was so bad, but I do know that he still had no reason to take it out on us. Story 2. M and son request for $29,000 from my dad. Entitlement galore part 2. So I reposted one of my older stories yesterday. This is a continuation of that. This would be long as well, so again, please bear with me. For this story, there are 3 main people to consider. The entitled mother, who I'll call M, her entitled son I'll call ES, and my dad, D. As stated in my previous post, my dad, 6'4", went through a really difficult financial crisis a few years ago, beginning in 2016. He had invested heavily in the real estate market, and at that time, the market was doing horribly, so it did affect his finances to a great extent. Let me introduce M and ES. M is my dad's cousin and in her 60s. She had 6 children with her late husband, all within the range of late 20s to early 50s. Her son, whom this story revolves around, is in his early 40s right now. In 2009, ES lived in the village with M, where he ran a fairly successful pineapple farm business, and then there were allegations levied against him by the family of the deceased that he had killed their relative. The police were involved and they found no incriminating evidence, so like most things in my country, the case went unsolved. However, the deceased's family were angry and swore to take justice into their hands. They planned to have him killed, and this frightened M. She called my dad one day in 2009 and told him what was going on and begged him to please let ES stay live with us in the city far away from the village because she feared that if he remained in the village that he was going to be killed. My dad, not wanting to see her lose her child, agreed to help him, and so ES arrived at our home in early 2009. He was in his early 30s at that point. Upon arriving, he got a job at a bar and grill fast food restaurant where he worked at for about a year or two before my dad helped him get a decent job at an insurance firm. He had an entire room and bathroom all to himself and never paid rent or utilities. He never paid for his own food or bought his own groceries. Whenever an appliance broke at home, my dad would replace it and ES would take the broken one. From flat-screen TVs, refrigerators, bed and mattress etc., my dad let him take them all. He had them fixed and gave them to his sisters who had just moved to our city. My dad took care of him and his needs as though he was his own child. My mom wasn't exactly thrilled about him moving in with us in the beginning because it was so sudden, but given the life and death nature of the situation, she accepted it. When my dad retired a few years later and got his gratuity, he assisted most of our extended family financially, and in that spirit, he gave the ES a check for what amounts to roughly $6,000 to help him out, and he was really thankful about it because he said he'd never been gifted such an amount of money before and he didn't think people were that generous. We lived in relative bliss until 2016 when my dad's financial issues began. Around that period of time, we did struggle a lot. Most days, there was no food at home, and to his credit, ES used a part of his savings to assist the family back then, but it was never free. However, it didn't really matter because in that moment, without that assistance, we'd probably have starved. He'd buy food items and groceries and also lend my dad some money. All these expenses were always repaid every few weeks when my dad received some money because the assistance received from ES were loans and you always pay your debts, and secondly because my dad didn't expect ES, who was also struggling and figuring things out too, to cater for the family. Things generally continued this way until 2018 when there was a resurgence in the real estate market in my country. My dad was finally able to sell both properties, each for around low six figures, $. That influx of cash pushed us out of the red into a more comfortable position. After the sale, my dad's first major purchase was a car because we'd sold both of our cars during those difficult years. There weren't a lot of people who came to our aid during that period, so as a way to show gratitude, my dad gave the ES a check for about $5,000 to $6,000. Now this is where the entitlement began. ES knew how much both properties sold for, so shortly after my dad bought the car, ES came to him with an itemized list informing my dad that he had decided to go back to the agricultural sector. He wanted to start another pineapple farm, but not just pineapples, but he also wanted to grow oranges as well. As a male child, he had inherited some plots of land in the village after his father died. He planned on using that land for the business. By this time, it'd been almost a decade since he fled from the village and most of the pressure and threats had died down, so he felt safe returning, and besides, he wasn't actually going to be living there seeing as he still had his job in the city. He simply wanted to set it up and have his mother run it for him. He had already discussed his plans with his mother and she was excited about the idea, and then he handed my dad a list of everything needed to pull this off, and he needed an initial capital of what amounts to roughly $29,400 from my dad to begin. My dad was stunned. He asked him if he realized just how much he was asking for. My dad said that if he had even saved up a fraction of that money by himself, then maybe he'd have been willing to see what he could do, but he expected my dad to pay for everything, which wasn't okay given that all four of my younger siblings were in boarding school, which was kinda expensive, and he was also making college plans for them as well, so he wasn't in a position where he could just give out almost $30,000 just like that. This annoyed the ES, so he asked my dad to loan him the money instead then, but again my dad refused to do that because there was no guarantee that he could make back that money in a year from a startup business. My dad offered him 10%, $3,000, of what he asked for free to try and help him, but that wasn't good enough for him. I can't forget the statement he made when my dad said no, nor can I forget his tone. He said, "So you say you won't give me this money? Okay, No problem, and then he stormed out. He didn't care about my dad's reasons or my siblings' well-being. All he cared about was himself. This was on a Tuesday, mind you. On Saturday, his mother came to our house unannounced from the village. Neither her or had informed my parents that she was coming. The things she said that day, she unleashed every ounce of resentment she had for him. Prior to this, he'd always looked upon her as the sister he never had and treated her as such. We'd just had lunch that afternoon when went to pick her up from wherever she got dropped. She went on a tirade. She began by telling him that what he was doing was wrong. It's been a few years, but I'll try to recall her words to the best of my ability. How can you treat this way? Is this fair? You sold the properties for hundreds of thousands of dollars, converted from local currency, so what is $29K? You have forgotten how supported you when you were struggling? You have forgotten how he spent his salary on you and your children every month, and now you cannot even help him with this small thing even though you have the money. She said all this in front of my dad, mom, me, and my young siblings. My mom sent my siblings to their rooms because it was no atmosphere for children. I can't remember everything she said, but I do remember this part. You have also forgotten about the numerous times when I used to bath and clean your mother. My grandmother had dementia during the latter years of her life, and unlike in Western countries, the concept of housing for senior citizens isn't very popular here, so instead the family usually takes care of their own. My dad viewed her as his sister, so he asked her to please look after my grandmother for him since he was in the city and she and my grandmother were both in the village. My dad visited every month and ensured that they weren't lacking for anything. He gave her monetary gifts or food items etc. as a way to say thank you, so while she was in fact helping him, my dad did show constant financial appreciation until my grandmother passed. Through her tirade, my dad said nothing. He is extremely quiet and hates conflict, but my mom is the exact opposite. She doesn't take bullshit from anyone. When she brought up my late grandmother, my mom raised her voice and began to chastise her about her behavior and began pointing out every single detail of the extent my dad had gone to help Do you think your son would be alive today had my husband not agreed to let him move in with us? She said this while pointing at Weren't they after his head after the allegations made against him? How many people have given you $6,000 not once but twice free of charge? How many people would open their home to someone who is suspected of murder? But my husband did it because he loves and values his family above almost anything. Yes, helped us out when things were really bad and I'm thankful, but he was always repaid in full. Do you not care about him training his own children? If he gives you that money, do you not see how that would disrupt the plans he's made for his own kids? How can you both be this selfish? How dare you come into our home and raise your voice at the man who has protected, fed, and housed your son for a decade? How dare you bring his late mother into this? When you took care of her, did you receive nothing in return? He never provided for you financially or look after you while housing and taking care of your son as well. This shut M up. So much more was said which I can't remember before my mom asked M to leave. To show you just how little shame he had, continued to live with us for a few months before eventually moving out. My dad refused to ask him to leave because he knew was already making plans to leave. When all this went down, was in his late 30s, so he was old enough to know better. To this day, my dad never lets any member of my extended family visit. He often wonders where exactly he went wrong or what heinous crime he committed against them, and it always upsets me whenever he talks about these events because of just how much pain it still causes him to this day. That's all for today. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.